My name is Dana Yip. I'm interviewing Mr. Don Cunning. Today is July 13th, 2012. Hi, Mr. Cunning. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be part of Coquitlam's history.
Thank you very much for coming. So, when did you move to Coquitlam?
I didn't move to Coquitlam. I was hired to come to Coquitlam in 1950. At the time, I was an itinerant pro-rec instructor, and pro-rec was an acronym for Provincial Recreation, which the province of British Columbia provided throughout the province. And that was an organization that started in 1934, thanks to the Depression, and went on till 1954. So in 1950, I was assigned a number of pro-rec classes. One of them was in the basement of Our Lady of Lourdes Church. So I got on an interurban in Vancouver. I got off in New Westminster and got on a Fraser Mills bus. I'll never forget it. We got as far as Braid Street, and that was a zone change. And there was a packing house there, and a slaughterhouse. And Burnett Street Creek, I remember looking out the bus window, was absolutely red with blood from the slaughtered animals. And a lot of people from Coquitlam worked at this packing house, but the stench, while we waited for the bus driver to collect another 5 cents, so I'm busy shuffling through hoping I got 5 cents because I want to get out of that terrible environment. Gave him 5 cents and ended up right in front of this house on King Edward Street. And I got off the bus. I had no idea where Lady of Lourdes Church was. So I walked over to Trev's confectionery, and I was astounded to see slot machines in this little coffee shop beside the municipal hall. And I asked Trev's wife where this Lady of Lourdes Church was, and they said, well, you just go down to Laval Street and turn left. So it was 1950 that I first arrived in Coquitlam, and then in 1954, after teaching at Our Lady of Lourdes School, which was a subsequent position, actually in 1951, I was offered a job as the physical education teacher at this École Notre Dame de Lourdes, as they called it in Millardville. In Coquitlam, they called it Lady of Lourdes School, which was an elementary and secondary school. And here's this Protestant, non-French speaking individual was offered, and I negotiated a contract with the Catholic Church. And I negotiated a contract where I lived in the rectory at Laval Square as the Protestant, non-French Canadian, living with Father Joe Fouquet and Father Albert Zygmunt. So I had these two priests and myself, and that was part of my contract. And they also provided me with access to a red pickup truck. I always remember that, a 1940-something red pickup truck. And I could use that a few days a week. And we developed a great physical education program at Lady of Lourdes, and particularly in your field, in gymnastics, simply because the church started out, the gymnasium was the basement of the Lady of Lourdes Church, and it wasn't until 1951 that they built a high school. and 1954, in August of 1954, the provincial government passed an order in council that closed the pro-rec movement and said under the Municipal Act that every municipality in British Columbia, if you wish to get any money from the province, you must form some form of a commission, a recreation commission, a park and recreation commission, arena commission. So there's a whole series of commissions. And at that time, there was a councillor by the name of Rennie Gamache, who was a very strong social credit member. And this provincial government was, for many years, from the 30s right up till 1953, was a Liberal government. But in 1953, it changed over to a social credit government, and they introduced a recreation commission system. And this Rennie Gamache and Reeve Christmas approached me and said, Don, would you consider acting as our advisor and being our part-time recreation director for the District of Coquitlam? And I agreed to that. And so I was teaching at Lady of Lourdes and doing part-time work for the municipality. And then because of, we went for some displays out to Essendale, and I was headhunted to take a position on the recreational therapy staff at the Crease Clinic. And so I really didn't leave Millarville, but I resigned my teaching position and took this new recreational therapy position at Riverview Hospital, but continued coaching these gymnastic teams at Lady of Lourdes, and advising and working with the municipality to develop a public recreation department. And Centennials played such a big role in the development of Coquitlam's Park and Recreation Department. 1958, when 100 years earlier, in 1858, there was a colony of Vancouver Island and the colony of British Columbia. And this colony of British Columbia was created simply because gold miners were going up the Fraser Canyon, and the government realized, wow, we don't have any policing authority. So they, in 1858, created a colony of British Columbia. And so in 1858, we had these two colonies. So the province had this centennial and gave money to municipalities to build a centennial project. And that project happened to be an outdoor swimming pool, 25-yard pool, 6-lane pool was built in Blue Mountain Park, the first outdoor pool of that size in Coquitlam. During the war years in Mackin Park, volunteers created 2 circular swimming wading pools, but they were more than wading pools. They were possibly 3 feet deep, and one circular pool still exists today in Blue Mountain Park, which was also built during the early war years of 1940s. But this centennial of 1958 really moved recreation and parks in Coquitlam, where they had a major recreation facility. And at that point, at 58, I decided to go back to UBC and work on my degree. And I continued to at UBC. I didn't receive my degree in physical education until 1962, but I kept working part-time here in Coquitlam. And in 1962, they honored me, the Chamber of Commerce, with the Citizen of the Year Award for my work with street corner youth here on Burnett Street. And I was also then invited to be on a committee to have Coquitlam's first ice arena. And there was a lot of opposition to that on council. Councilors would say, reasonably so, I guess, well, what's wrong with taking the kids and ourselves to Queen's Park? I mean, we've always done that. Why would we spend $500,000 to build a 6-sheet ice curling rink and an ice arena? And so that took a lot of proselytizing on the part of a number of people, including myself, to get council to even allow the question to be asked to the people. And it was they made it so difficult. I always remember there was a councillor Butler on council and a councillor Bob Boylo, and they were adamant that we should be taking our kids to Queen's Park. We don't need them here in Coquitlam. But they finally said, well, you can have a referendum, but it's got to be in August of this year. So we were faced with this curve to ask people to approve a $525,000 referendum, which was over the moon for people in Coquitlam. They'd never had that type of money question before. In August, in the middle of the summer, we're going to ask them to talk about ice. And lo and behold, thanks to the Chamber of Commerce and a bank manager by the name of Ray Mitchuk, who was managing the largest bank in Coquitlam at the time, which was the Royal Bank at North Road in Lougheed. And I approached Ray and said, well, Raymond, you have the largest number of telephones in Coquitlam in one place, in that bank. So can we use your bank to bring in volunteer mothers and dads to phone and get people out to vote in August for an ice arena? And we did. And that passed. So in 1963, with great pride and even for Councillor Boylo, the late Councillor Boylo, and Councillor Mike Butler, we opened this $525,000 6-sheet curling rink and ice arena up on Poirier Street. And that was in 1963. But then there's Confederation comes along. And so in 1867, fast forward 100 years, 1967, another centennial. The governments are saying, hey, here's some money. Federal will give you $1, province will give you $1, municipality, you kick in $1. So 33-cent dollars. And the municipality, under Reeve Christmas at the time, said, we will make the Social Recreation Center our project, our centennial project, up on Poirier Street. And the only thing up on Poirier Street at that time in 1967 was Centennial High School, because the year earlier, in 1966, is when these 1866 both colonies became one. So we celebrated that kind of clandestinely. It wasn't high profile, and that's why they call it Centennial School. Is because it's the centennial of the two colonies of British Columbia coming together. But it was low-key compared to the next year of 67, which was 1867, the big Confederation. So here we had an ice arena now on Poirier Street. We had a Simon Fraser Health Unit building. Wow, we got a social recreation center where people can go and have parties and weddings and meetings and so on. We have Centennial School built next door, and we have the school board office in Coquitlam. For when I first came to Coquitlam and started the Recreation Commission under a councillor, Betty Fry, I had to go to New Westminster to talk to the superintendent of schools, which was a gentleman by the name of Roy Stibbs. And Roy Stibbs Elementary School was named after this fellow. And I had to go into the courthouse in New Westminster to meet Roy Stibbs because I wanted access to schools for recreation programs. And so it was some years later that they built this tiny little office, first of all down on Austin Elementary School grounds, and then up on the Poirier Street. The school board office ended up in Coquitlam. And back then, the mailing address for Coquitlam residents was not Coquitlam, BC, it was New Westminster, BC. And Millardville also had its own postal address. And once in the late 50s, when Harbor Chines subdivision developed, the postal code for Millardville fell off the plate. It was no longer referred to as Millardville, BC. It was Coquitlam, British Columbia. And we got away from using a New Westminster address. So here we are now in 1967. In 1968, the city, I was then the full-time recreation director, and in 1968, the city offered me the position of park and recreation director because the city of Coquitlam had a parks board chaired for many, many years by a fellow by the name of Manny Gio. And Manny Gio was a counselor in Coquitlam in the late 30s, all through the war during 40s. And he was the chairman of a parks board. And their first superintendent of parks in Coquitlam was a fellow by the name of Reg Caddy, who was one of the greenkeepers at Vancouver Golf Club, where Manny Gio was the head greenskeeper. So he knew his grasses and he knew his trees, and he was a most interesting gentleman. But the idea of having a recreation commission and a parks board fell out of favor, and council said, we're going to amalgamate this. And they did, made it into a park and recreation department with one commission, a park and recreation commission. And names like Danny Doyle, who chaired that commission for a number of years, Ray McDonnell, the father of former council member Doug McDonnell, served on that committee. And they offered me this position in 1978 to be the Park and Recreation Director. I always remember they offered me a salary of $740 a month. So I accepted that. Going back to the 1967, where we had built the pool, and then 1871 was a centennial when British Columbia joined Confederation. So in 1971, again, we have another centennial. And that's when the city decided to build Chimo Pool. It opened in December of 1971, and that was the same year that Fraser Mills rejoined Coquitlam after breaking away with Port Coquitlam about circa 1912. So they joined the party in 1971. Coquitlam got its first 6-lane indoor swimming pool on Poirier Street, and that was a big event. And then 1991 ended up with Coquitlam's centennial project, since it was created in 1891. 100 years later, 1991, we had this year of celebration, and Coquitlam hosted the 1991 Summer Games. And that transformed what we know now as the town center area of Coquitlam. We had the Coquitlam Shopping Center in place under Jim Tunn's mayoralty, and now we had Lafarge Lake. And sidebar on that one, Lafarge of Canada leased from the province 120 acres of gravel pit on Pipeline Road, which is now the Town Center Park and the Percy Perry Stadium and Lafarge Lake. But think of it as a 300-foot high pile of gravel. It was a veritable little mountain. And Lafarge of Canada leased from the province this chunk of land. And they mined it down and they mined it down to the point where they were almost at the level of the adjoining road, which was Pipeline Road. And Coquitlam had a long-standing bylaw that said one could not excavate below the elevation of an adjoining road. So here they are, just a few feet above Pipeline Road, when I get a phone call from the CEO of Lafarge of Canada, asking if Don Buchanan, the city planner, and Eric Thiessen, the assistant city planner in Coquitlam, and myself would join this gentleman for lunch in Vancouver at one of the Vancouver hotels. And we went there to have lunch with this gentleman. We knew what he wanted to do, and what he wanted was permission to mine below the elevation of Pipeline Road. And I knew that Coquitlam Council would not go for that. And so that was a real conundrum. We weren't sure how we were going to get around it. And the serendipity of the day was the waiter came and filled up our water glasses. And the light bulb went off in my head. And I said to the Chief Executive Officer of Lafarge of Canada, you know, sir, that water in a park is like a fireplace in the front room. So if your company would turn over its 5 acres of freehold land in perpetuity as park to the municipality, and your company would create a man-made lake to our specifications, I would take that concept to council, and I have every reason to believe they'd probably buy into it. And he reached across the table and shook my hand, and that's how a glass of water became a lake in Town Center Park. That's the history of Lafarge Lake. And just a serendipitous thing. I have no idea what would have happened if that waiter hadn't come and poured that glass of water. But that's the story. It went from a glass of water to a lake, just like that. And when I brought back that concept along with my colleagues, Don Buchanan, the chief planner, and Eric Thiessen, the deputy planner, council bought into that. And voila, there it is today. It's the showpiece and the centerpiece of the whole town center plan of Coquitlam, where the city hall is, where the SkyTrain is. And interestingly enough, across the street, as you know, is where Douglas College is today. And the #1 fire hall is created, and Pine Tree Secondary is located, and the first 50-meter indoor swimming pool in Coquitlam is located. And guess what? Those lands were also gravel pits. So the one thing gravel pits did for Coquitlam, although they brought a lot of bad press, the one thing they did, they held in reserve large parcels of land because you couldn't do anything else with them. They were being mined. But once the gravel operations ceased and there was a future plan there, it wasn't a hard sell for us to talk to Bill Day, who was the president of Douglas College at that time, to say, hey, come join the party. And to the school district to build a high school so that there's this not only good cooperation, there's seen to be good cooperation. There's a high school, there's a college, there's a city park right across the way, and we can all share in the benefit and we can all share in the cost. So it's a quid pro quo. And so 1991, and thanks in no small measure to a gentleman by the name of Brian Camfield, who is well known for his role as president and CEO of TELUS, then BC Tel. He stepped up as a Coquitlam resident after being asked by Mayor Lou Sikora to chair the Centennial Committee. And he brought on a team of principally TELUS senior executives. And they put on a games in Coquitlam that would be very hard to duplicate, and created a real town center. So in short, while I came to Coquitlam in 1950, and it was the sticks, I can tell you, I've had the privilege of seeing the Harbor Chines development take place. I've had the privilege of seeing Blue Mountain Pool as 1958 as a centennial. I've had the privilege of seeing 1963 in the opening of Coquitlam's first indoor ice arena and curling rink. In 1967, the first social recreation center, to see Centennial High School in place in 1966. In 1971, to see the first Shimo pool created. And then 1991, to see the Town Center Park developed, and Dogwood Pavilion, Bowling Green, Centennial Oval totally transformed into an up-to-date running track and internal playing field. And all of those improvements attracted residents to Coquitlam. But the big one was the 91 Summer Games. When developers saw this jewel of Lafarge Lake and the stadium and playing fields and a college. And then Westwood Plateau came on stream. And I also had the privilege of being a member of that planning team, and building school park sites on the Westwood Plateau. But the generator for a lot of these developers was saying, wow, look at this jewel, we got to get part of the action here. So Allard Gravel Pit, which was just to the north of the town center park, owned by Jimmy Allard Sr. and his two boys, Barry, the youngest, and Jimmy Jr. And their property was sold to developers. And so right to the very north of the town center park now is this huge residential development. But I should mention in the Allard family, they have a long history in Coquitlam. Some of their uncles and grandparents were on council here. Tom Allard was a council member in the 30s, for goodness sakes. Other Allards you'll see in the 1940s. But Lorraine Allard, the mother of Jimmy and Barry Allard, she used to swim every day, like a day like today, a beautiful summer July day. She would swim back and forth the length of Lafarge Lake. It was amazing. Her office was just, 3 blocks away. And she'd get out of the office, walk across that dusty old gravel pit while we were developing it, and she'd swim every day in that Lafarge Lake. She was an amazing woman. So that is a kind of synoptic. Mundy Park, if I talk about parks for a minute, Mundy Park with its beautiful jewels of Lost Lake and Mundy Lake. And if the citizens of Coquitlam, if you haven't been in Mundy Park yet, you got to get in there and have a walk. I mean, it's a jewel. But there's an interesting story to that park too. And we have to flip back to 1871. Because in 1867, when there was the Confederation of Canada, British Columbia wasn't part of the party. They didn't join Confederation in 1867. Quebec did, and Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, but not British Columbia, nor Manitoba or Alberta. It wasn't until 1871 that John A. Macdonald convinced the provincial legislature, come join the party, join Confederation British Columbia, and the quid pro quo is if you join, we will extend the Trans-Canada Railway to Port Moody. Well, yes, we'll join. So 1871 comes, we join Confederation, but the railway doesn't arrive right at the time. It arrives some years later. In the meantime, speculation's going on. And land speculators are saying, wow, the western terminus of the CPR is going to be in Port Moody? Well, let's start buying land up on the highlands and everywhere else we can. So Mundy Park was subdivided into hundreds of lots, and people bought that land. And when the railway finally arrived, John A. Macdonald's no longer living, and the head of the CPR says, hey gang, if you think our sailing ships are going to go under what today is the Lionsgate Bridge, as well as the second Narrows, forget it. Because Port Moody, you just have a very little flat land, and then things start to go up slopes, mountains. We're not stopping here. We're going to Vancouver. Well, the land value just plummeted. And so a lot of people, fast forward to the Depression of the 1930s, people would get a tax notice, people living in Vancouver, for 35 cents for a parcel of property that Granddad bought. It's out in the bush somewhere in Coquitlam. And they're saying, you got to be kidding, 35 cents? Hell, we don't have 35 cents. I'm not going to pay that. So the land reverted to the Crown, to Victoria. And then Victoria turns the land back to the municipality. And the municipality had all these unpaid tax lands, and they decided, oh, we'll call this Mundy Park. And so that's how Mundy Park became Coquitlam's jewel. It was kind of Coquitlam's Stanley Park. And it wasn't by good planning, it was by bad luck, or by good luck. Good luck if the CPR said, hey, we're not stopping. Bad luck if you had invested in land back then. So that's another story that a lot of people in Coquitlam probably have never heard, but it's an interesting side note to one of the jewels. And so Coquitlam can really pride itself on places like Blue Mountain Park that has always been a park from the get-go. It's serendipitous that when Como Lake High School opened in 1953, that the school board had the foresight to build Como Lake and acquire that land next to, contiguous to, Blue Mountain Park. So we had a school park site, something a lot of places in Canada would die for, because a lot of times the park's there, 6 blocks down the road is the school site. But here we have a school park site, Blue Mountain Park and Como Lake, later to become Como Lake Winslow. And a sidebar to that one, in the southeast corner, at the corner of King Albert and Porter Street, there was a fire hall, a 2-bay fire hall in the corner of Blue Mountain Park. And this school site, Como Lake School Site and Blue Mountain Park, were just divided by a line on a map. And Porter Street didn't go through. It wasn't until Porter Street School opened and Harbor Chines subdivision had built north of there that this fire department, a fellow by the name of Bunny Falcon, who was a 5'0" in height fire chief and quite a character, convinced council that, hey, we need to extend Porter Street through from Winslow to King Albert. So the fire truck can respond in a more direct route. And so that's how Porter Street became what it is. Likewise, the head of the school board at the time was also very involved in scouting, and his name was Harry Monk. And Harry Monk chaired the school board for a number of years, but very involved in scouting. And it was Harry Monk who talked Reeve Christmas and his council member into allowing the Scouts to build a scout hall in Blue Mountain Park. And that's how that came to be. It had nothing to do with the Park and Recreation Commission or the Parks Board prior to that. I know my office as the department head, I just got an edict. There's going to be a scout hall built, no questions asked, and it was built. But that part of Blue Mountain Park, beside on the Como Lake School side of Blue Mountain Park, was just a heavy forested bush. And there was a trail that the kids would go through to get to the baseball park. And we had a chairman by the name of Ray McDonnell, who wanted to beautify that part of the park. And so as part of the 1967 centennial, the Park and Recreation Commission centennial, they created that waterfall in Blue Mountain Park and developed that landscape feature. And then serendipitously, 1971, a Native Indian chap, a stone sculpture, came into my office and said, "We've got tons of huge blocks of stone from an island off British Columbia that the legislative buildings are adorned with, and a lot of the big buildings in Vancouver. And we'd like permission to have a stone sculpture symposium in Blue Mountain Park." I thought, that's kind of wild. And so we threw all caution to the wind, and these stone carvers came in. And as a result, today, you look at this, there's about 8 very interesting stone sculptures in Blue Mountain Park that happened because of this Native Indian chap whose name escapes me at the moment. It was his vision, and I bought into that vision and proselytized the Park and Recreation Commission to go along with it. And I know Lou Sikora was in a state of paroxysm when when he saw these great chunks of rock showing up in Blue Mountain Park and slowly being crafted into art. I mean, it's amazing. So Blue Mountain Park has this great history. Coma Lake Park also has some interesting history to it. For a long time, it was not a portal water source, but a secondary water source for fire for Fraser Mills, and it had a pipeline connected Fraser Mills to Coma Lake. And Coma Lake often would flood right over Gatensbury Street. It was just totally impassable. And there were large greenhouses across Gatensbury Street at one time, and Coma Lake Park has over the years developed into a wonderful walking park with great visibility, so women feel safe there by themselves. And that park will always be a wonderful place. The island is a story on its own. The Public Works Department had a drag line that was sitting idle as the gravel pits were closing down in the town center, where the municipality had a gravel pit, actually where the #1 fire hall is. And so I asked if we couldn't have the dragline operator and his equipment come up to Coma Lake and just cast out as far as he could and drag out the muck off the bottom of the lake, because it's a peat lake and it fills in. And I'll never forget one beautiful morning, I was standing at the south end of the lake watching this operator drag material off the bottom of the lake, and he was piling it up behind him. And as this pile of earth was growing in height and in weight, all once I saw the surface of the lake starting to ripple. And I thought, my goodness, have we got Have we got an Okopogo or something like, Okanagan Lake? What's happening here? And right in front of my eyes, this island pops out. That little island at the south end of Como Lake, because of the compressible soils, as the weight of that pile pushed down, the peat popped up in the lake, and that's how that island was created. I almost infarcted when it was happening. I thought, my God, I can't believe this. And then sometime later, one of the staff on the Parks Department, a fellow by the name of Peter Licht, Licht, was a foreman. And on his own initiative, he was planting trees in Como Lake, and he had one tree left over, and on a beautiful sunny day, he waded up to his neck with this thing on boards and floated that tree out there and planted it on the island. And that's, the in-house thing is, we call that Light Island in Como Lake. So there's another little bit of history for you.
I'm sorry, what year did that all happen?
This was circa 1983, 84, yeah. So that island popped out of nowhere at that time. And then another park of interest, has some interesting history, is Brookmere Park at the west end of Austin Avenue, at the end of the Vancouver Golf Course, right across from Christmas Manor. And Christmas Manor was situated on what used to be an agricultural property. There was an agricultural association. In fact, it was called Aggie Park. It's just a couple of building lots. And we we sold that land, and with it, we acquired Brookmere Park, which was also a gravel pit. And so you can imagine now this is a gravel pit that was mined below the elevation of Austin Avenue. It was quite deep there. And the school board built Brookmere School as an elementary school. And at the time, the Lougheed Mall property was nothing but farmland. And this developer came into my office and said, we want to develop this Lougheed Mall, and we have a lot of excess soil that we would like to donate to the city if you have some use for it. And I said, well, that's a wonderful idea. I have the exact place for it. And that is, I want you to fill Brookmere Park to this given elevation. And specified, we didn't want stumps and logs and all that kind of stuff. So the history to Brookmere Park, it transformed itself from a gravel pit to quite a nice little park, and part of Brookmere School, which is now a private school, I understand. And that was another bit of gravel history in Coquitlam, because gravel pits played a key role in so many ways. The former site on North Road where London Drugs used to be, on North Road, right at North Road and Lougheed. It's kind of a Korean sub-village now. But there was a London Drugs there, and that property, it too was a gravel pit in Coquitlam. And if you drive into that shopping development today, you'll notice there's a Greek restaurant at the corner of Lougheed and North Road. And right to the south of that, you'll notice the land falls off, and at the east end, as you drive through this property, you go up a bank, and that's the bank of a former gravel pit that was there. Likewise, as you proceed eastbound on the Lougheed Highway and you get to Gilby Street in Lougheed, there's a motel there. It's been many different names to it. I don't know what it's called today, but that motel site too was a gravel pit, and the gravel from that was used to build the Lougheed Highway in the early 50s. And then we spoke of the big gravel pits at Lafarge, and of course Mary Hill in Port Coquitlam was a huge gravel pit. And as we go up, just below what used to be Westwood Racetrack is now Westwood Plateau, the Westwood Golf Course. You have the Seawee gravel pit operations and the Allard gravel pit operations. And those areas will certainly be future park sites for Coquitlam, I'm sure. So there's a bit of a terse overview.
Thank you. If you don't mind, can I bring you back to 1950?
Yeah.
Where you taught at, what was that church that you taught
Lady
at?
of Lourdes.
Lady of Lourdes?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what it was like to work with your students there?
It was, Malarville was very much a French-Canadian Catholic, almost colony in this non-French Canadian environment. And the nuns were of the Sisters of the Child Jesus order, so they all wore their habits, and the children, a number of them had real difficulty with English because they had no reason to use English. And I can always remember just to teach a forward roll, I would say to them, now be sure and jump with your feet together and do this roll, and I'd demonstrate it, but they weren't getting it. And I had to say, saute, rolle, comme ça. And then they got it. And and they tried very hard to get me to speak French, and they would have me singing, tu ne peux mettre mon ta maison comme des hommes, and boomity boom satambala, and we'd be doing all these songs. But the children then had nothing. The playground was on quite a slope. It was very rocky. When it had heavy rains, the church basement would flood, and the church basement was the community hall. It was their gymnasium, and the one thing they did have a lot of was chairs. And so I introduced the children into what I call chair tumbling. It was a routine that I developed, and it worked out well because every home had a chair, so the children would go home and they'd practice what I would teach them on the chairs at home, and they developed quite an interesting chair tumbling routine using chairs. But the children were so appreciative of everything I did, and as their skill levels increased, we would be invited to participate at lacrosse games at intermission in New Westminster. And I noticed that the children, the families here did not travel much further than New Westminster. Very few of the children, when I asked them, have you ever been to Vancouver? No, I've never been to Vancouver. So I made a point of taking them out to UBC and to various educational institutions for displays. And it's interesting as I reflect back, I don't know how much it had to do with it, but we would take them to competitions to the University of Washington. Some of them even went to the UCLA in 1960 something, early 60s. I took them to the U.S. National Championships at the University of California. We traveled to New York and competed in Quebec. And as a result, I would like to thank Riel Finnegan, one of the boys here that achieved his engineering degrees in UBC in fisheries. Joe Marchand was just a young kid when I started here in Millardville. He ended up teaching senior physics at Kelowna High School. And the McIntyre family, Walt McIntyre ended up being a school principal in Terrace. So a number of these youngsters did very well. Another one I just ran into recently, one of the students by the name of the Duhamel, Alfie Duhamel family that lived just above Lavelle Square. And he spent his whole career in the Canadian Navy, and he did very well thanks to his gymnastic training. He made the national touring team for the Navy, and they did high box vaulting at P&Es and the Toronto shows, etc. And he's forever grateful for that training. Yeah.
Well, when it flooded, when it rained, there would be floods in the basement.
Oh, yes.
Were you there when the floods happened?
Yeah, I was, at the time, I was an itinerant pro rec instructor, and I'll never forget, I didn't have a car at the time, and I took the interurban and the bus out here, which was a major journey. And I get out here, and here's the tumbling mat floating in about 2 feet of water. The chairs are just about to become boats. And I always remember I was so annoyed at the priest and the Sister Superior for not having the courtesy to phone me. You know, I come all the way out here to find out that the gymnasium, you know, if you can call it that, the basement of that church was awash. Yeah. So those are some of the hardships that they faced. I mean, it was real. They lived on a slope. Coquitlam had open ditches, and they weren't culverted. And when there was a blockage, the water would move from the ditch and run right across the playground and into the lowest point, which was the basement of Lady of Lourdes Church. And that was always in my mind. I also remember my office was a house that was immediately behind the original municipal hall here at 1111 Burnett Avenue. And this house faced Marmont Street. It was a former residence. And I remember my secretary on a very stormy day saw these children playing as they will with the water just rushing down Marmont Street in this ditch, and one of the children fell in it. And this poor kid, he went under Alderson Avenue in the culvert, and was swept right down until he hit the debris bars at Burnett Street, where it went under Burnett Street, and he drowned in that open ditch. So open ditches were not something that, we often think of Richmond. I mean, Richmond, at one point, I guess there may be a few of them out there still, but at one point, when I was a young kid, if you drove your car off the road in Richmond, you were gone. They were 12 feet deep, but we didn't have anything like that. We just had open ditches. But at times, they were hazardous places. And I'll always remember that blood-curdling scream from my secretary, and by the time I got to the boy, along with others, and pulled him out of that ditch on Marmont Street, he was lifeless. But yeah. So the water would flood. There was an apartment block at the corner of Nelson and Burnett Street, which annually the lower suites would always flood. And Mackin Park at Nelson Street, the water, by the time it came down that elevation change, it had a velocity to it. And so it was a real challenge for parents to keep their children safe.
So, what did you do if it flooded in the church?
Pardon me?
What would you do if it floods in the church and you arrive? Do you just go home?
Yeah, I just turned around and got back on the bus, and I had classes that afternoon, so I just cancel off my morning and go to my afternoon classes. Yeah.
And did you have any star pupils that you remember of your gym class?
Stars? Yes. In 1954 was the first time we entered a Canadian championship in gymnastics, which was at UBC. So we entered a team from Our Lady of Lourdes High School, and Gilbert Brackenay won the Canadian championship in vaulting. Joe Marchand won a free exercise championship. Jules Gagnon won a Canadian championship on parallel bars, I believe. And Neil Godden was only 12 years old, and he won the junior boys tumbling championship. And Neil went on to, in '59, to qualify for the Pan American Games trials in Windsor, Ontario. And he won the Canadian men's tumbling and senior men's trampoline championship. And of course at Coma Lake High School, when I was there as a PE specialist part-time as well, we had a girl by the name of Diane Comboy, who also was an excellent gymnast, and she qualified for the Pan American Games trials in '59 and the Canadian Championship. So those two students in '59 I took back to Windsor, Ontario. And as I say, we went to those same kids, Marchand, Finnegan, Godden, Brackenney, we went via New York to Lachute, Quebec, for championships against the Quebec kids. And so it was a great edifying experience for these students. They still talk about it today as life-changing.
Wow. You also taught other courses at the Lady of Fart?
No, I was a phys ed specialist. So that was my area of specialty. But I would move into, I would take advantage of some of anatomy. I would try and teach the kids, tie back to English, such as to remind them that the longest muscle in the body that starts at the hip and moves down to the inside of the knee is called the sartorius muscle. And that's the longest muscle in the human body. And I would tell the kids the story about tailors who would make men's suits. And tailors would sit with their legs crossed. And it's the sartorius muscle that helps in the abduction of the knees to move away from the center, to abduct. So this abduction has a lot to do with the sartorius muscles. So these tailors would sit on the floor with their legs crossed and make men's suits. So today, when you see a man that is well tailored, well dressed, you say, you look very sartorial. And that's the connection to the sartorius muscle of your body. So I would use those kind of anatomy lessons to broaden their understanding. And likewise, in the springtime, when kids are seen going across the finish line in track with their chin up, I would talk to them about the importance of the scalenus muscles and the sternocleidomastoid, which you can grab a hold of. So your sternocleidomastoid, but particularly your scalenus muscle, are tied from back here to your first rib. So a coach that's teaching track and knows this realizes that putting your chin up not only moves your body forward, but it also expands. When you put your chin back, your ribs expand because it's tied to the first rib. So put your chin back, your rib cage expands, and that gives you more oxygen to get across that finish line. So that's the connection of the scalenus and sternocleidomastoid muscles. And so, or I would use to try and tie them into their algebra. And people have difficulty remembering of the two bones in our lower arm, the radius and the ulna. Now, which one is on the thumb side? And the way to remember, I'd stand behind a skeleton, and if you watch the thumb of the skeleton and turn it over like this, it forms a radius. And so the radius bone is always on the thumb side. So those kind of lessons, and it's amazing that some of the students say, you know, I still remember that. Kind of the wow lesson. So from being dressed sartorial to the scalenus and sternocleidomastoids to the radius little trick. And I would not just say to them students to point your toes, but I would ask them to, I would say, plantar flex your toes and dorsiflex your toes. So dorsiflexing is not going to get you points in gymnastics, but if you plantar flex, or when you plantar flex when you're diving, so that again is another anatomical thing that I used to just tie into my teaching, or to be in a prone position. So when your palms down, it's a prone position, or to supinate is when your palms are up. So you pronate, you supinate. So if you're lying prone, you're lying flat in your face, but if you're in a supinated position, palms up, you're flat in your back. And so that's how I tried to do that, yeah.
And you carried this method every school you went to?
Yeah, I employed that, and not for the very young kids, but for the high school kids, and it sticks with them.
What is your age group of teaching then?
I taught from elementary right through to grade 12. Yeah.
All at once?
Yeah, well, not all at once, but my responsibility at Lady of Lourdes was from grade 1 to grade 12. So that was the mix. So that's why we had, grade 4, 5 kids. It wasn't uncommon to have, out of 40 students in grade 5, to have 38 of them walking on their hands. And that's why kids like Neil Godden would won a Canadian championship at age 12. I mean, he was only in grade 6. So by the time he got to be grade 12, and now at Como Lake High School, because the Catholic school had a great problem with bus transportation. And they, at one point in about 1951, I think it was, they marched in mass up to the school board office to protest the fact that the public school buses would not transport kids to private school. That was a big issue with them, and they lost. But yeah, so it went from grade 1 to grade 12.
Which of the other schools have you taught this at?
I was invited to be a PE specialist at Como Lake High School, and I worked with Mr. Ed Gaucher, who was the head of PE there at the time, and we used to put on mass displays at Como Lake High School, and the gym would be packed with taxpayers, resident parents, and we would put on major gym displays, which are now few and far between. I always felt that there was a responsibility for the teachers in various subjects to publicly display what they're teaching the children. And the people that do it well today are music teachers, music programs, band concerts. They proudly display the skill sets. Drama teachers do the same thing. Their dramas are wonderful. But today, you'd be hard-pressed to find a physical education teacher who has a physical education display, as distinguished from athletics, where there's a basketball team or soccer or rugby, but basic physical education, we would put on displays of mass calisthenics and pyramids and ballroom dancing. And that was another thing of course, I was single at the time, and Sunday Sunday afternoons, Sunday evenings, I'd open up the gym and teach kids how to jive and how to foxtrot and waltz and tango and all these dance steps. And you know, the golden rule I used to try and emphasize to kids is, in dancing, you always put your weight on the closing foot. Not sometimes, not once in a while, always. Because boys particularly, but girls to, I think, pretty well to the same extent, if they don't put your weight on the closing foot, then you don't know what foot to step out on. And if you put your weight on one foot, you can't move it. So you, in the closing of a foxtrot, if you put your weight on the closing foot, then you step out with the right foot, always. Kind of a golden rule. So we would have square dancing and round dancing, and calisthenics to music was always there. And then because the kids didn't have a lot of equipment, but the mill was available, we'd get the mill to donate kind of almost like floor hockey sticks or brooms, about so long. And we'd teach the girls to use these wands to do various moves to music and lunges at the same time. And so we'd put on these displays, and chair tumbling was another example. That was a novelty. But we would get hundreds of people coming up to Coquitlam Lake High School to watch those things. And then one of the highlights was always gold statues. We'd get the boys with a bathing suit and a bathing cap, and we'd mix gold powdered paint and glycerin. And the kids they just love doing it. They just smear their whole body, and now they're all gold. Just close your eyes and smear it all over. And we'd have them doing these various kind of Greek Olympic statue positions, and we'd have special lighting from the drama group guys and gals up on the stage. We'd involve the New Westminster Regiment Band for the Grand March in, and you know, the drum rolling when we needed to highlight different things. Those became quite famous at Coquitlam Lake High School in the 57, 56 era. Yeah.
Did you have an annual
Yeah,
festival?
it was annual, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What kind of music did you play?
What kind of music?
Yeah, what was playing?
In terms of the dance music that the kids would play, we would use rock and roll wasn't here then. Yeah, so the term, anachronism today, I guess, was jiving, and they just loved doing that, and the waltzes were standard, and foxtrots were standard, and South American tangos, the same music, same tango music then as today. You know?
When did rock and roll come to Coquitlam?
When did it? After I finished teaching. Yeah. It was very big in the '60s, for sure.
Did you like it?
Oh yeah.
So you were not living in Coquitlam while you were teaching in Coquitlam? Were you living in Vancouver?
I wasn't living in Coquitlam from 1950 to 1952, and until I negotiated a contract to live in the rectory, which was a very edifying experience for me. I got to tell you, I lost a lot of money to those priests who would play chess, and they were great at it. I was terrible, but it motivated me. So I lost a few quarters and dimes, especially to one fellow here who was a head of the Caisse Populaire. And the Caisse Populaire used to be located in almost like a Vancouver Sun paper shack size, or province newspaper shack. It was just behind Place des Arts in their parking lot. And this Mr. Goulet lived across the street from the rectory, and he would come over every night to play chess with Father Fouquet or Father Zygmunt. But if they weren't there and I happened to be there, he'd go home with my money.
Can you explain to me what it looked like where you were staying? What was it called again? With the two priests?
In terms of what it looked like in the neighborhood here, Fraser Mills was very much in operation. King Edward Street, that was right in front of where we're doing this interview, the mill houses, the distinct little Fraser Mills houses were all the way along. There was a boardwalk went down King Edward all the way to the mill. Mackin Park, on the east side of Mackin Park, was tree lined, so it was almost, it was very beautiful. Old trees lined the whole street. The Lougheed Highway wasn't here then. The buses, the Pacific Coast, PCL it was called, Pacific Coastline buses, used to travel along Burnett Street here. And the next stop was Essendale, now called Riverview, and then Port Coquitlam. There was interurban that you could get on in Sapperton, and it would take you to Vancouver. It was called the Trout Lake Line, or you could take an interurban from the foot of 8th Street in Columbia into Vancouver via almost the same line as the SkyTrain today. Or you could take a tram to Richmond. And these things move very fast, and they were a great transportation system. So people could move very readily. And I was struck when I saw a picture of a hockey team in Fraser Mills in 1914, winning the provincial hockey tournament. And they're all decked out in full hockey gear and these huge trophies. So I asked myself, where would they be playing hockey in 1914? Where was their artificial ice? And I thought, well, maybe they just, because there was an interurban train that went right to Fraser Mills. So they get on the interurban. Maybe they went to Queen's Park Arena. But no, Queen's Park Arena didn't have ice in 1914. And I thought, well, maybe the Forum in Vancouver at the PNE had ice. But no, they didn't in 1914. But where they would go at the entrance to Stanley Park at Denman in Georgia, but very close to Cole Harbor, was the Denman Arena. And this was a huge wooden brick structure. And so that's where they played hockey. And the Vancouver V's were quite a famous hockey team out of Vancouver. And so what they'd do, they'd simply get on an interurban right here down in Fraser Mills and change in New Westminster and ride it right down to Hastings and Carroll Street, and then get on a streetcar to Stanley Park and get off at Denman and walk for about 3/4 of a block towards Cole Harbor, and there they are. And that's where they played hockey. So back in 1914, they had this great transportation system of interurbans. And yeah, that's where Fraser Mills hockey team used to move by. But when I arrived here in 1950, it was the Pacific Coast stage lines that ran through here. And a lot of people worked, most of them here worked, the French-Canadian community worked in Fraser Mills. A non-French Canadian community, a lot of them worked at Essendale and now Riverview, or they worked in the BC Penitentiary when it was located in New Westminster, the federal penitentiary.
How much did transportation cost
Uh,
by bus?
it was, as I recall, it was something like 10 cents to go to Vancouver. It was, by today's standards, a real bargain.
Mm-hmm. So after your teaching gym, do you know where the students would go after school around town to hang out?
Yeah, the kids after school would hang out locally. Trev's Confectionery, which was right across the street from where we're doing this interview, was a place where kids would go for a milkshake. But the popular place, there was a theater right between the Woods and Jubilee hotels, Sam's Theater. And so Sam's Theater was Saturday afternoon matinees. That's where you found the kids. During the week, being primarily a Catholic community, the CYO would have all kinds of things going. The French Canadian Scouts and Girl Guides were very active. Music was always big in Millarville. There was the sisters always had music lessons and singing lessons, and so there was a lot of good pianists and violinists, and I noticed that there was a lot of home entertainment. When I would be invited to a home, often after dinner you sit down at a piano and they'd be playing the piano and they would be singing until midnight. It was just that kind of small town, wholesome entertainment, yeah.
Were there lots of televisions here?
Television? Well, television, yeah, it became part of the fabric of the community. You know, people had their rabbit ears for their one channel and their little box, and if a wealthier family had a TV, then and they had kids, well, then other kids would gravitate to that house to watch television, yeah. And CKNW radio station, Bill Hughes and his roving mic, for the parents, that was everything. He would be at the Pacific Stage bus terminal in New Westminster every morning at 7:30 in the morning, and he'd interview people getting on and off the bus, and everybody listened to Bill Hughes on his roving mic. And I used my relationship with Bill Hughes. I would go there, and he would welcome me, Don Cunnings, as if I was getting on the bus or getting off it. What's new in recreation in Coquitlam? So I would say, well, there's a woman's Keep Fit class Wednesday nights at Winslow School. And this program's going on. And so we promoted recreation through CKNW's roving mic like you wouldn't believe.
Were you a frequent guest?
Yes, I was, yeah. And ironically, 60 years later, Bill Hughes and I still go out for lunch.
What would Bill Hughes usually interview people on the bus for?
He would interview people as to where they were from, and that was most interesting. And they were from all over the world, and I was struck by the fact that somebody would say, "Well, we're from Bloomington, Indiana." Oh, I say, it's been a long time since I've been to Bloomington, Indiana, but is the Hoosier still doing well there? And Bloomington, Indiana is the home of Indiana University. And he had visited, I don't think they've tripped him up on too many places that he hadn't been and knew. Yeah, it was amazing.
What was the fashion trend that was really, really big at the time?
The fashion trend was for boys that wear kind of a zoot type of thing. It was a narrow cuff and fairly wide knee in the boys' slacks. They're very. You had to take your shoes off to get your slacks on or your pants on. And the girls were kind of saddle shoes. There was a brown slash or a black slash. They call them saddle shoes, and they always wore white short socks and sweaters. Kind of floppy, loose sweaters were. For the school kids, that was very, very popular.
On Sundays, did you attend church?
Did I attend church? Yes. I attended. I attended occasionally in the Catholic Church while I was here, but I always attended the United Church in Vancouver, and still do. Yeah, and that was one of wonderful things about the people of Millardville. They never pushed me in any way or coerced me to join the Catholic religion, even though I lived in the rectory. You know, it was always this professional relationship, and they respected boundaries, be it beliefs or religion, and I was always very pleased about that.
Did you ever listen in on one of their church ceremonies?
One of their what?
Their church
gatherings.
Services? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I would go to a midnight mass for a number of years, but in Lourdes, the whole service was in French. You had to go to Fatima for English. Lourdes was totally French.
Can you describe your interpretation of it?
My what?
Your experience watching a French.
Yeah, struggling to grasp enough words to put a sentence together in my head. It depends how fast the priest spoke. Sometimes they spoke quite rapidly, but I found it kind of an interesting cultural experience to watch how they would listen to the priest, especially in the early 50s. I was particularly interested when they were speaking English. The priest had a great influence in the early 50s over the parishioners politically. They would make no bones about it, that, I expect you to be supporting Monsieur Goulet or Monsieur whatever French Canadian, Boileau, or to expect you to support Monsieur Gamache. And so there was no bones about that. And they were very upfront about that, who they wanted on council. And that I found sobering. And over the years, I saw that diminish down to zero. They just don't have that sway over the parishioners but they certainly did in the late 40s and early 50s, that's for sure.
Do you know what changed their minds?
What changed their mind, I think, was just cultural pressures and more people having education. Not just the priest with a university degree, but many people with advanced education. And that was kind of a cultural change.
Can you describe what a family dinner would be like? A typical family dinner.
Yeah, the family dinners that I attended, starting off right in the rectory, they had an elderly woman who prepared the meals for the priests and for me, because I was living in the rectory, and they were always very nutritious and very typical of potatoes and vegetables and carrots and the meats varied from roast beef to pork and apple pie. I can remember that. And then when I would be invited over to the convent, which was on the same property in Laval Square, and Sister Rosemarie phoned over to the rectory once and said, Monsieur Cunnings, would you come for supper? So I thought, well, that's wonderful. I'll go over for supper. I ring the bell at the convent. The door opens, and there's Sister Superior. She shows me into a room. There's one large dining room table with a dark green cloth, looked like a billiard table. One chair for me. I thought, I can't believe this. So I'm sitting there, I've come for dinner in isolation. There, the sisters are eating down the hallway somewhere, and they're bringing me they brought me pop, tea, and a beautiful meal. I remember having a lovely mashed potatoes and almost like a Christmas dinner, but by myself. And I'll never forget that. I thought, wow. So thereafter, I always made sure that Father Zygmunt came with me. And I didn't particularly like eating by myself. But on the other end of the continuum, I'd be invited up to the Chabot family on De Leicester Street. And Mr. and Mrs. Chabot had 3 or 4 children. And it was absolutely typical Canadian meal. You know, it was great. And that's where I used to see the music in the family afterwards. Mr. Chabot would play the violin and Mrs. Chabot would play the piano, and oh boy, we'd be singing there for hours. Yeah.